Have you ever wondered how to talk about race in the workspace? Systemic racism, it is important for managers to empower employees and provide them with resources for having productive conversations about race. Dr. Nika White will unpack how important this really is. We are excited to have you here with us today. This conversation is going to be on fire. I am looking forward to you all meeting my guest today. We value your feedback and opinions. Please drop them in the chat. We intend to respond to as many comments and as many questions as possible. This takes a great deal of effort on our part, and I'm really grateful for all my loyal guests. Every week, sometimes even twice a week, we create new content, and we look forward to you subscribing to our YouTube channel and to keep up with us. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a DEI consultant and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The link to purchase my book will be in the comments. And for a living, I help organizations implement DEI plans and reframe their cultural mindsets through thought-provoking workshops and webinars. Join us as we continue to share the different voices in the DEI space. Dr. Nika White is a national authority and fearless advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. As an award-winning management and leadership consultant, keynote speaker, published author, and executive practitioner for DEI efforts across business, government, and not-for-profit and education, Dr. White helps organizations break barriers and integrate diversity into their business frameworks. Her work has led to her designation by Forbes as a top D&I trailblazer. Today, we welcome Dr. Nika White. Welcome. How are you today? And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, Rochelle, thank you so much for inviting me on your Diversity Connects Us platform. I really look forward to being in conversation with you, and I'm really excited to delve in.
Awesome. Can you tell us something that the audience might not know about you? One thing, so we can try to relate to you.
So let's say that the audience might not know about me. Um, let's see. I'm trying to think what to share because there's so much that I feel like people know about me because I am pretty routinely sharing a lot about my life on social media. Um, I enjoy travel. I enjoy spending time with my fur baby. I have like a 15, 16-year-old Bichon, and he's the only one in the house now because my kids are grown and out of the house and they're in college, and so he keeps me company when they are away.
Oh, how does that feel to have them out of the house? Do you have to refigure things out and fill in the gaps when they're not around?
No, it feels wonderful. My husband and I are really enjoying being empty nesters. I love when they come back to visit, but I've gotten so used to having, the home to myself during the day. And so, yeah, I love their visits, but yes, that's what it's what we do. We help our kids to go fly and be free. And so I'm at that point now. Yeah.
Absolutely. And to be independent and to see the fruits of your labor.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Mm. So let's dive in. So, does talking about race, you believe, cause mistrust in the workplace?
I think it can, but I think that, what we need to interrogate more so is why does it cause mistrust? And I think that from my experience, when the conversation of race has created divisiveness in the workplace, it's because the culture of the workplace is not conducive for people to feel free to have constructive candor with each other as they are really unpacking and processing different circumstances, whether it's happening internally or even, externally to the four walls of the organization. I think also where mistrust comes in is when the conversation is mismanaged. And what I mean by that is, is is the culture conducive to where there are community agreements that can help ground everyone around these really tough conversations, right? Are people really engaging with the level of curiosity that causes them to engage in dialogue whereby they aren't reacting, but they're more so listening to learn and respond? So I think that there's so many missteps right now that organizations have not intentionally implemented that is creating a bit of distrust around the conversation of race. But I don't think that it has to be that way. It is important for us to acknowledge difference, and race is one of those significant dimensions of diversity that we can't shy away from. And so, not having the conversation, I think, does not serve us well. We have to be willing to broach the conversation in a way that is productive, that is healthy, but that certainly helps to center equity, because we can't talk about equity if we aren't willing to talk about race. And I know that organizations who really value the work of deepening their commitment to diversity and inclusion and belonging, it's necessary to be able to talk about race, because that is where I think that we find our grounding and how to be intentional to create equitable systems and policies and procedures that allow for everyone to have full opportunity for success. So yes, there is some mistrust, but I think it's more about interrogating why does that mistrust live right now in organizations where people are challenged by conversations of race.
Right. Do you think also that it really takes, you know, my book is about emotional intelligence, and I really think leaders, thought-provoking leaders, CEOs, C-suite level leaders,
Mhm.
really need to understand not only their own unconscious biases and the stories that, that they've been telling themselves. We tell ourselves too, because we all have unconscious biases,
Sure.
right? And I think there's a level of, why am I thinking the way I think when we talk about, emotional intelligence? Do you think that's an important part in being able to have this type of conversation?
Well, absolutely. I think that emotional intelligence, it helps us to be self-aware when we engage in dialogue that we know can be challenging for some people. And so if we're attuned to that emotional intelligence, it gives us the ability to then be very directive about how in which we may enter into that dialogue. Not everyone is coming to the conversation of race fully knowledgeable, fully aware of self, and even of just the general constructs of race and how it shows forth and why it's important. And so I believe that that emotional intelligence allows us to be thoughtful about, how do I engage this person? How do I navigate this conversation in a way that allows for people to give themselves permission and agency to follow their curiosities, so that they're exercising constructive candor around it. And so I definitely believe that emotional intelligence is an incredible tool that benefits us all, regardless of how delicate the conversation may be, but certainly for conversations like race.
Right.
Resistance, I often say, is a lack of clarity. And so if someone
Mm.
is resisting entering into dialogue, it's usually because they are uneducated, and being uninformed and uneducated about a topic certainly can cause us to wish to disengage, to not exercise that high level of emotional intelligence. And sometimes people can feel like, I am putting myself in a position where I can be guilted, shamed, blamed, attacked, and no one wants that. And so I think there's a lot of complexity around the race conversation that we have to consider. And definitely at the core of it is the willingness to lean into that emotional intelligence. And let's face it, Rachel, for a lot of people, the reason that the conversation is hard is because they just don't want to engage in the conversation, simply because perhaps they like the fact that they are a part of that dominant culture and they want to maintain that power. And so I think that we have to consider our audience and maybe what their intentions are, how they are entering the conversation. Not every conversation is meant to be had with every person by every individual. And that's also a part of our emotional intelligence as well. Am I the vessel? Am I the mouthpiece that should be delivering this message? and delivering this message and having this conversation at this precise time. And so I think that it takes emotional intelligence on all parties to realize if they're being triggered by something, then maybe that is a moment in time where I need to take a step back and really evaluate questions like, am I the right person to deliver this message right now? And what is the best way to deliver the message? Sometimes it's not just a face-to-face conversation. Sometimes you have to think about, what can I do to warm someone up to this conversation? Maybe it's share articles, or bits of nuggets here and there. Maybe it's also identify who are those key stakeholders and influencers of that individual that I'm looking to influence, that perhaps may have greater social capital with that person. So there's a lot to consider as it relates to this very complex topic of race.
Right. You said some pretty important things. And when I go back, to what you said, it triggered something in me. And I realized, why do you think it offends people when we talk about race? Why do you think it has to do with, them being fragile, or feeling that they're going to be put in a position that they have to divulge information that they are not right now comfortable with?
Rachel, I think it's all of the above. I think it's certainly the fact that some people just aren't comfortable. And part of that discomfort has everything to do with not knowing how to respond, the uncertainty of what could surface in this conversation that may cause me to feel like I need to defend myself. And when we get into that mode of feeling like we have to defend ourselves, there's a certain level of aggression that can surface, right? And when aggression meets aggression, the conversation ends, or either the conversation escalates to a very unhealthy place. And so, entering dialogue, not knowing where the conversation could go, when you realize that the topic is very delicate, it certainly creates this guardedness that I think sometimes prevents us from really being able to navigate those conversations effectively. And then, as I mentioned before, I think that in society we have witnessed and experienced so many hard realities of the ugliness and the harm behind discrimination, race discrimination, that it's triggering for a lot of people. And so even those who may have the best intentions of really just trying to listen, to learn, and to influence and gain perspective, I think that it can quickly, escalate, just because maybe we aren't fully aware of what triggers us. Um, and I also think that sometimes, if we aren't careful, we will engage in dialogue about race with individuals who are not equipped to have that conversation, simply just not equipped, because they have either reached a place and a point to where they're so dogmatic about their position on it, or even sometimes they may create harm by saying things like, I don't see race, I don't see color. And that is also harmful, because it's an erasure. It's an erasure of who people are, and their identity, which is very important to them. And so, um, I think there are a number of reasons why this conversation can feel very uncomfortable, and why there's a lot of resistance. And let me say this too. I believe that we have to be willing to press through, power through our discomfort. We have to choose courage over comfort, because it's not going to go away, right? This race is not going to go away.
We're not going
The
away.
conversation is not going to just, completely go away just because we feel like it's uncomfortable. So I don't want to deal with it. And again, I would rather us to cause people to feel some sense of discomfort and to sit with that discomfort, and hopefully growth comes out of that discomfort, than to just ignore the conversation altogether. Because in order for us to really be able to realize an equitable society, there's no way we can do that without talking about race and the constructs of race, and how it continues to show forth across every system. So we just have to
Absolutely.
we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is what I know a lot of people are not willing to do.
Right. And it's interesting you said we have to get uncomfortable with being comfortable, or vice versa. I think, or actually, yeah, uncomfortable. But the thing is, with being uncomfortable, it has us being put in front of a mirror and facing exactly what it is that's happening at that moment. And I can give you an example. I think I mentioned it briefly backstage. When George Floyd was murdered, there were a lot of emotions that occurred within me, and unresolved emotions based on race and
Yeah.
how I was affected by racism growing up. I'm now living in South Florida, but I was living in Montreal for 35 years. And I didn't realize what I was going through in Montreal until 35 years later when George Floyd
Mm.
was murdered.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and I think what you said was interesting because I was in a very uncomfortable position where I had to come to terms with what was happening to to my race
Yeah.
within my family culture. I had to make do and understand that it was a process. And I went through a process of anger, and I knew during that process I couldn't really communicate with that many people.
Yeah.
Right. And then I went through a process of I am, if we didn't have my daughter, I was the one who was going to go on the street and Black Lives Matter, and my fists were up, and I was very livid. And then after that, I shifted and I was very sad. So then as I was sad, I realized that there were things in me that I had to make amends with, and I had to find a way to communicate what it was that I was feeling. So on the other side of the coin, that uncomfortable space that I was in was an angry space, and that was the space that I chose not to speak to that many people because I had to come to terms with what was going on or what had happened.
Yeah, no, that resonates with me, Rachel. I think that so many of us, particularly those of us who are in this space of DEI work, we had to navigate that time, following George Floyd's murder, where we were expected to be the strong ones. We were
Right.
expected to kind of hold space for others as they were processing and navigating the complexity of, does my employer even care about what just happened and how that has impacted me personally and how that may now impact how I show up to this workplace and what support is available to me? And so it definitely resonates. I think that the silver lining behind such a traumatic situation that was so visual and was so hard is that it did cause a lot of people to realize that even in my discomfort, I can't sit on the sidelines. I have to engage in meaningful dialogue to help educate myself first and foremost, and to help know what part I can play in helping to dismantle this systemic racism that we continue to see show forth. I even think back to, Rachel, the framing of the question that you asked. Why does it offend people when we talk about race? And if I were to be honest, even that question, if I were to really interrogate it at its core, was triggering for me because I'm thinking, why are we not asking? Why are people offended by someone's race? So it's all, the framing sometimes can really also be a tool and how in which we may engage people, how in which we may think about or reimagine some of these conversations that we know we need to have. But I tend to care less about people being offended by the conversation,
Mm,
and I care more about the fact that people are offended by one's identity. You
right.
know, and that's the conversation that I think we need to be having. So anyway, I just wanted to share that. But yes, I definitely resonate with all of that you communicated, that you were dealing with and that you felt, and I think so many people probably also could align with those sentiments.
Right. And when we think about the demographics in general, who should be having these conversations? Us?
Yeah,
Or, it's like you said, there's a fine lining right there, and
yeah,
I'm not and we also have lived and shared experiences.
yeah, that's such a big question of who should be having the
Right.
conversation. Well, my short and simple answer, which is I'm using that language very loosely because there's nothing simple. It's very complex, but a short answer is everyone. This work belongs to all of us. And I do realize that there is a perception out there that I also subscribe to, that there is a stronger sense of responsibility and onus that falls on the white dominant community to make sure that they are really leading the way of helping to resolve these issues that they continue to benefit from. Many white individuals who are well-intended will say, well, my ancestors did that. I didn't create that. No, but you're still benefiting from those systems that are creating harm for people who look like me. And so in that regard, there is a sense of responsibility that you should own. Now,
Right.
as a Black woman that is a practitioner in this space, I know my responsibility as well. And I made a conscious decision as a DEI practitioner and as a Black woman to say, I want to be able to leverage whatever emotional capital I have to be able to engage in this work, right? Not everyone has that calling. Not everyone has that ministry. Not everyone has that as their purpose, and to each its own. And so I am also keenly aware of the harm that can be caused by the expectation on Black and Brown people to always have to be the voice of reason, the voice of compromise, the voice of educating our white counterparts on things that they have ample resources to be able to learn on their own. But I also hold in mind that part of the white community's role in being allies and really helping us to dismantle these systemic issues and systems that continue to harm Black and Brown people is that we have to help them get proximate to the lived experience, right? And the best way to do that is to be willing for those of us who have that emotional capital and that wherewithal to help collaborate with them. One of the things that I say to allies most often is that at bare minimum, allyship is about action, not just any action, but useful action. So how do you ensure as an ally that your action is useful for those in which you're allying for, those historically marginalized communities? You have to get proximate to the problem and to the issues. You have to understand those lived experiences. And that comes, if you are a white person, that comes from asking questions, being curious, and doing your own research and your own learning, but then also being willing to, in a very collaborative way, ask questions of those that you've built relationships with, that you're allying for. What does support look like for you in this moment? Questions like that are really critical. Otherwise, we assume that we know how to support those communities that are being discriminated against. And what we feel like could be a solution for that may not be the solution, right? And so I believe that there's a challenge in how in which sometimes people enter this conversation where they place all of the responsibility on one party only. And I do think that it's a shared responsibility. But I'm also very much in alignment with people being self-aware enough to understand, what can I take on at this moment in time? And it may be that I don't have the capacity to take on any of it, right? And that's okay. And let's let those individuals to have great permission and agency to say that without causing them to feel any type of guilt, right? We can only make that call for ourselves.
Right.
And I'm talking about the Black and Brown people when I say that.
Right.
Yes,
Absolutely.
I'm talking about the Brown and Black people. There is definitely a heightened level of responsibility and onus that I think the white community should carry right now. Yeah.
Right. Before we move on, I have quite a few comments here from our audience. And Catherine Castro, thank you so much for joining. And I'm going to look over and read. She said quite a few things this morning. So she says, who delivers the message? Absolutely. I learned this in my counseling group. Someone's I'm not the one, and that's okay. She said,
Yes.
you right? And she's like, we're not going anywhere. Reminds me of the grieving cycle. That's what I went through. And she says, I hear you, sis.
Mm, yeah.
Right. There's definitely I'm sure she was probably referring to, what we were talking about early on about George Floyd and and also what we need to do as a Black race. And I hope I am pronouncing his name well. I see him also in all these beautiful spaces. He's in Amsterdam, I believe. And
Oh,
please correct me if
Michael.
yes.
I
I'm
had a
reading
feeling
it
it
and
was
I'm like,
Michael. Yes.
yes. And I was going to ask you, how do I pronounce? I do not like to mispronounce people's names because it's part of our identity. So it is Michael. And
Mhm.
he said anger is part of the healing process.
Yes, yes, exactly. Exactly. It is. It is. We have to let ourselves have full agency and permission to follow our emotions where they take us. I think that for
Right.
so long, part of the harm that has been created has caused us to just, harbor all of that. And and then we're expected to just kind of get over it. Well,
Right.
it's easily said than done. And so I certainly appreciate Michael's commentary there. Yeah. Um, and that's okay. We're gonna feel angry. We're gonna feel sad. We're gonna feel frustrated. We're gonna feel exhausted. I mean, all of those feel words are real, and we need to
Right.
validate them,
Right.
not cause people to be shunned because they're feeling that type of way. Because we all process differently, and
Right.
I think that was some of the frustration too from that I heard from many individuals who had to return to the workplace after George Floyd's murder, and it was almost business as usual. They didn't allow people to really feel what they were feeling. And what they didn't realize is that not only was it personally impacting those individuals, it also was impacting performance and productivity. Because what happens outside of the four walls of an organization, if we think that's not impacting the way in which people show up to our organizations, interact, make decisions, and work with each other and collaborate, then we are misguided, because it definitely does. And so I think that was one of the big lessons that many organizations had to face and realize after George Floyd's murder.
Absolutely. Do you think that, this is probably, let's go there. do, you,
Let's go
do
there.
let's go there. So do you think that, DEI is something that's new? Do you think it's something that's trending?
No,
Because
no,
I'm reading a lot of posts and I see, this is a
yeah,
new thing and this is trending and,
yeah.
something that's only come about since George Floyd's murder.
Well, it's definitely not new. I do believe, without a doubt, that George Floyd's murder created this groundswell of reality for a lot of people who, prior to maybe seeing that very visual and hard evidence that yes, these type of things do exist, they happen. I think that it caused people to have a heightened sense of appetite to again start exploring it further, start engaging in dialogue. And once you become aware and you deepen your exposure, then you can't help but to at least engage in conversations around, should we be exploring this? If we do, what does it look like? And that's what was happening. And so, Rachel, I'm sure that you saw this as well. But after that time, DEI practitioners all over were inundated with calls of organizational leaders wanting help to navigate
Right.
this. What do we do? What does it look like?
Right.
So it's not new. I think there was a newfound energy and appreciation for the reality of it, to where it created an opportunity. And
Right.
although it was bittersweet the way in which the opportunity came about, I think that what we have to do as individuals who are champions of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging is, let's see this as, how can we fully leverage it to get more people now into the conversation in a way that can lead to meaningful change, meaningful, sustainable change. Um, and that was really my mantra when I went through the process myself after George Floyd's murder. I was already committed, but I saw so many people counsel out organizations and
Mm,
individuals, right? And
right.
I've spoken about this before. I understand it, but I'm not a fan of the council culture. I believe that it does more harm than it does good. I believe that people enter this conversation at different places, right, within their learning journey, and we have a choice to make once those individuals enter into the conversation. That is to counsel them out and push them away because we're attacking them, we're blaming, we're shaming, we're guilting them, or that is to help support them on their journey towards really finding meaningful ways to help us all emerge stronger. And I just choose the latter because, again, I do believe that resistance is often a lack of clarity. Now, that
Mm,
does not at all take away the need for true accountability, right? I'm not saying we give people a pass, but I am saying that we need to be very thoughtful about how in which we bring people along.
right. So, it requires a lot of introspection also on how to bring others along, because generally
Yes.
speaking, we don't know where each individual is coming from. We all know that they do have a story. We know that that story is being rehearsed, and it's a narrative that they've acquired over time, and that's the story that's being told also in corporate spaces. Right? So I think also at the same time there has to be, we just have to jump in.
Yeah, there's no really good starting point that's
No.
going to work universally within an organization for everyone.
Right.
And so I work with a number of organizations, and Rachel, you probably experience this as well. And there's always this tension point among those who feel like we aren't moving fast enough, we aren't doing enough, we aren't really communicating this message in a way that is strong enough, and we need to turn up the intensity, right? And then
Right.
there are others that are saying, we have to help bring people along. We have to make sure we're meeting people where they are. We have to make sure that we're slow walking this. And so you have to somehow find some ways to meet in the middle. And for those who are ready to kind of go deeper and go deeper, how can we leverage that momentum for greater traction? And then also, how can we make sure that we aren't turning those off that are just unawares? Maybe they're on the fence because, again, that resistance is because of lack of clarity. And how do we take that into account? And so I believe that part of this is in our learning and development strategy and the different modalities that we are leveraging to help bring people along. Not everyone learns the same way. You're not going to be able to start at place Z for
Right.
someone who's just entering the conversation, right? You need to start at point A for them and then walk them through it. And so that's why I'm a big fan of not just having a one size fits all approach around exposure and awareness as we are building people's knowledge and understanding around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need to be leveraging strategies that include different tools, different modalities, different resources, and different ways, different messengers, right? In order to help bring people along. And we can never feel like we have arrived at a place where we have communicated to the full extent, because we need to even help people to unlearn misinformation, to relearn, right? And so it's a constant cycle. And sometimes we want to just, check a couple boxes and feel like, okay, everybody should be already at the point that we want
Right.
everyone to be. Now let's go. And
Right.
it's a continual process.
I'm happy you said that. I was shared this, it's called A Union of Professionals, American Educator, a journal of educational equity research and ideas. And just last night, I received this. And when I turned the page, it said exactly what you just said. So, yes, indeed. He says here, his name is Eric Ward, and he's a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements,
Mhm.
hate violence, and persevering inclusive democracy. He's also the recipient of a 2021 Civil Courage Prize, the first American in the awards of the 21st year's history. He currently serves as the executive director of Western States Center, which was created for the widely used at dismantling racism organizational changes programs in the 90s, and currently equips educators with
Mhm.
confronting white nationalism in schools. So
Mhm.
the article is very long, but one thing he did say here, he says racial prejudice and violence are learned and can be unlearned.
Mhm. Mhm. They really can. It's a choice though. The person has to be willing to
Right.
even go through a process where they are exploring what does it look like to unlearn, really, but yes, I do believe that people can change. Do I also believe that there's a subset of people that have made a firm decision not to change? Absolutely, and that's why the whole notion of we have to bring everyone along is not always realistic. So we have to define, what does bringing everyone along look like? Does it mean that whatever the non-negotiables and the behaviors that are indicative of creating harm, are we now holding people accountable in that regard? But we're not always going to be able to change people's hearts and minds. I am more about, can we create a culture and an environment where we are very explicit, though, about what are those behaviors that fall within the constructs of how in which we view inclusive behaviors and leadership
Right.
versus what's not. And when those non-negotiables are being breached, then we have a choice to make. And that takes leadership. That takes leadership. What are we going to tolerate? What we tolerate will continue. And so if we allow those behaviors to continue, then we are making a decision on our own, even as leaders, and that this is okay.
Right.
And it's not okay.
Right. And that leads to a toxic work culture,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's and I think also in organizations, and I'm going to ask you the questions, and what are the most prominent obstacles organizations have right now, you think?
Yeah, there's so many that come to mind. One of which is not fully operationalizing a lens of DEI throughout all aspects of the organization. Um, I often talk about the difference between activity versus impact. Activity has a start and an end date, and don't get me wrong, there can be some value
Right.
to DEI activity, like maybe some type of cultural event. But if we aren't careful, it is just a start and an end date, and it's for a moment.
Right.
I think that one of the challenges and the obstacles is that organizations will approach solving for DEI in a very surface way instead of peeling back all the layers, getting to the crux of the matter, identifying the root causes of issues that's compromising equity and inclusion and belonging, and solving for it there. And when they have that mindset, it tends to look like an activity of some sort. Rather, I think the bigger opportunity to sustain the work and the change process that needs to occur is considering, how do we approach this with the lens of creating meaningful, sustainable impact? And that is looking at systems, policies, procedures, culture. And oftentimes, what that entails is being committed through human capital, financial capital, to have a comprehensive DEI strategic plan that is an overlay to your organizational strategic plan that looks at all areas of operations. We have to institutionalize this work. Yes, the HR piece is a big piece, because organizations, their biggest investment is the human capital, but it's bigger than just the people aspect. It's also about our processes. It's also about our procurement practices. Are we including ethnic minority and veteran owned and women owned and LGBTQ plus business owners into the consideration set for bidding and procurement opportunities? How in which are we going to market and appealing to this broad audience? How are we ensuring a sense of belonging for those diverse and underrepresented or underestimated talent that we're bringing into the organization? Otherwise, if we're recruiting them and we're getting them in, that's just activity. Because
Right.
if we are creating the culture and the environment that allows them to feel like they have full opportunity for success, where they can grow and thrive and have psychological safety to feel like they can show up at their best, then we're just going to have a revolving door. And so the biggest obstacle that I see is that organizations are not taking this holistic approach, but rather they're trying to solve for it in a very surface way that yields just activity, 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 and not really looking at it from a systems change impact perspective.
Right. Something comes up. I had read an article in on online, and I know the state of Indiana and Idaho had banned K to 12 transgenders from partaking in physical education
Yes.
from K to 12. And we had a conversation, with someone in Indiana working for the government, and he was saying that, it's interesting that, there's such a holistic approach into having inclusivity, but then at the same time, when working with entities that are very, like you said, dogmatic or, conservative in their mindset, it's very difficult to be able to have those conversations because that mindset has already been ingrained. I know the two governors had, and I don't like to talk about politics, but at the same time they vetoed it, and now they wanted to have, a transgender training. And I
Mhm.
think that's where it really, that's right, that's where it really needs to happen, and not a one-off training where you take a LinkedIn course or any
Right.
course where, and then you say, okay, I've checked the box. It's actually, reframing the cultural mindset of the organization.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of trying to solve for huge systemic issues with the training. I think that learning and development is important, and I'm a big fan of learning and development, but it needs to be an ongoing strategy where we are continuing to find ways to build people's knowledge, right? And because this is not something that can be a one and done, to use your language. It has to be something that we continually expose ourselves to, and to deepen our knowledge. I mean, once you reach a certain point, I feel like with organizations, they will sense we've done all that we need to do. We've provided the training. Now we need to be able to expect that everyone's going to fully align with every content that found its way into the training. And that's not how this works, right? It's also about what are we doing to help ensure that the best practices and the tools that were maybe made available through the learning and development experiences. And that's usually how we talk about them at NWC. We don't like to use the word training because training sounds like a destination. We need an ongoing strategy of learning and development experiences of all types. Some may be very formal, some could be informal, but through that, we're helping to build up people's knowledge base, not just with the knowledge transfer, but also with the tools and the skill sets. And we're finding ways to ensure that from an organizational perspective, we are seeing how people are leveraging them. We have to connect the dots for individuals, right? What does this look like within the confines of our organization? How can this inclusive practice now really take root in the way in which we interact with each other, the way in which we collaborate? How does it align with our value sets and our guiding principles as an organization? We have to take it a step further. And that's also one of those areas that I feel like sometimes organizations have missteps because something will occur, right? And it's very reactionary. So now we're going to offer training. And then we're going to expect that because we've offered this training and we made it mandatory, that now everyone's going to be on perfect behavior, right? That's not how this works.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. And incorporating a DEI strategy, I know there is a lot that goes before and after, in discovering what the organization has in in place. If they do have something in place, how do you think they should incorporate a DEI strategy, into employee experience practices?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, in order to be able to most effectively align your employee life cycle with the lens of DEI, you have to have a pulse on the current state of the organization. And I think the best way to do that is not go off of theory or hunches or just anecdotal information. Certainly, you can have some insight that's gleaned from all of those assets I just mentioned. But more importantly, I believe in leveraging evidence-based data because first and foremost, when you have that data, it tells a story. And most often, from my experience, all data presents information
Right.
as opportunity. It can either be data that sheds a light on some areas that are is compromising maybe the overall workplace experience for certain individuals, or it even could be data that allows us to see where we need to be reinforcing some things,
Mm,
amplifying it, maybe doing more of it. So sometimes we approach the process of an audit or an assessment as, what are we trying to find that's wrong? What are the aha points and the gotcha points? And that's not how we should be viewing or even considering going into a process of doing a deep dive cultural DEI assessment. Rather, we should see all data as opportunity. And we should see it as a way to give us a clearer picture of our current baseline. That
mm,
information is so useful to then determining what should find its way into a DEI strategic plan. How do we prioritize all of those elements, right? And it's not just about gathering the data and looking at it from aggregate totals. We need to really dissect that data. We need to disaggregate that data and look at it across different dimensions of diversity, different populations and communities. Because I can tell you that if your organization is not incredibly representative of so many different dimensions of diversity and you're looking at just your aggregate totals, then you're probably going to see, some high percentages, right? And that could send this false sense of, we are okay, we're doing great, there's no room for improvement. But once we disaggregate the data and we look at it across maybe your LGBTQ plus, population, your Black and Brown colleagues, the story usually is different. And so I'm a firm believer that if you really are after impact and not activity, you're going to take the time and you're going to invest the dollars to make sure that you're doing a deep dive assessment where you're leveraging both qualitative and quantitative data collection strategies. You are, again, really interrogating the data across different data collection points to see where there's a relationship there. And then you're using that to inform what are some of those recommendations that needs to find its way into the final plan. And then with the plan, you aren't just thinking about what are those action areas and focus areas of opportunity that we need to prioritize, but what are the accountability mechanisms that we also need to align with those action items? What are the tracking and measurement frameworks that allows us to know if we are successfully reaching the desired output? And
mm.
so, your question was around, how do we do this in the sense of it impacting effectively the employee life cycle? Well, it starts first with gathering the data, not being afraid of the data, and really leveraging the data. For us, if someone just wants an assessment, but they haven't also talked about what they plan to do with the data, we are very cautious. And that's usually a red flag for us because sometimes it means we're just getting the data to get the data. If you don't plan to do anything with the data, you're going to have an adverse effect of actually just creating this exercise where you're asking people to lean into their vulnerabilities, to take the time to participate in a survey or a focus group or one-to-one conversation, and then not do anything with it. That is actually taking a step back, and that can do more harm than it can good. And so one of the counsel that we often provide is, do not undergo this deep dive assessment process where you're engaging your employees into this process, giving them this false sense of hope around some type of change that potentially could occur if you don't plan to do anything with the data.
Right. In essence, there has to be follow through.
Oh, absolutely. That feedback loop is critical. And not even follow through by way of, how do we now implement some of the information that we learned into a plan? But also, I think that we owe it to those in which have centered their voice and given their time to close the feedback loop by sharing, what did we learn, right? Sometimes, organizations are hesitant to really police the final report to where they don't want to share all the details. And I do think that there should be collaboration around what is shared and what's not, but not in a way to where you are lacking the transparency that I feel like is so crucial for this whole exercise. Um, and I think that it's serving organizational leaders well when they lean into that.
And
Because
be
why are you doing
vulnerable.
it? Yeah, exactly. To say, there's some areas of opportunity here that we're going to prioritize, that we're going to give some consideration to. Sometimes people will say, well, I don't want to ask these certain sets of questions because we know that we can't change that. And usually my
Mm,
counsel is, well, why don't we ask those questions still? Because it gives you an opportunity to say, this is what we heard, and this is what we can and cannot do. Just be forthright with that. And it gives people the agency to be able to know exactly where you stand. And if that's a non-negotiable for them, then so be it. That's the case. Because whether or not they will articulate that that's a non-negotiable for them, then they are in essence probably silently creating their exit strategy anyway if you don't do anything about it, you know. So I think there's a lot to be learned about the work that happens before building a DEI strategy and plan. Is how are you going to build it? And the best way is to build it from evidence-based data that allows you to be even more targeted around your approach to addressing some of those challenges that could surface from the data that's collected.
Right. And I think, you know, it's crucial to take that step to be able to understand, like you said, where their pulse is at, so
Yeah.
that you can have a broader understanding of where to go from there, and not to take a step back, because that's probably even more detrimental to the employees, because they've taken the time to do the surveys and to do the feedbacks,
Yeah.
and for them it gives them a sliver of light and hope that things might change. So it's imperative for the leaders of organizations to not take a step back, but to keep moving forward, so they can understand what to do
Yeah.
based on the evidence that they've gathered, to move forward and to create a more
Right.
inclusive workspace.
And to repeat that process, you know,
Right.
this should not be a one and done. I mean, yes,
Yeah.
once you've gathered the data and you've made some adjustments, then you want to, you know, a year or two later, maybe re-engage, you know, all of the employees to see how you've been able to change perceptions and attitudes. So that's crucial as well. You know, what's always surprising to me is at the completion of an exercise, when organizational leaders, which just happens quite often, will say, well, what's our score? What's our grade? Right.
Right.
And so I'm finding it now appropriate to, in the assessment planning, to make sure that we're educating around this is not to get a score. It is to give you a baseline, but it's not about a score, because the bottom line is that if you aren't at 100%, there's room for growth and improvement. Right. You know, and that's another reason why I'm not a big fan of benchmarking in the traditional sense. To me,
Right.
when organizations ask for benchmarking, what they're really looking for is a score or a grade against how they perform against others in
Right.
maybe their industry. And to me, I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because again, if you are seeking a score to validate if you're doing good, bad, or in the middle, then I find that sometimes you're less committed to whatever that margin of growth and improvement could be, even if it's just 10%, right?
Right.
And so for me, benchmarking is more about what are some best practices that we can glean from other organizations that we could then scale to size for our organization. We can modify given the nuances of our organizations, but not so much of to give me a ranking or a score. Because if there's room for improvement, then I do not want you being benchmarked against another organization to stifle your ability and to be a crutch from you then taking it to the next level and improving and growing. And so that's something that I'm finding interesting as I navigate these conversations with many organizational leaders.
Right. And is that a challenge? Is that a challenge for you to be able to
So
go
I
go
Yeah.
ahead?
So Rachel, I believe that when identifying a consultant partner, it is a two-way street, and that the client is, you know, vetting the consultant partner to make sure that they are in good alignment with what the output is that they're seeking. And the same holds true for the consultant partner. And so for me, my why in doing this work is I want to be aligned with brands and organizations that care deeply enough to not see this as compliance work, to not see this as checking a box, but to really be after the impact. And so questions like that, it tells me one to two things: that maybe that's where their mindset is at that point. And
Right.
once I engage with them further and share different perspective, are they able to shift? Are they able to then expand their mindset to understand, well, yes, maybe I shouldn't be looking at it as a score, you know, trying to get a score, if you will. And that to me is important. So the only time it becomes a challenge is if they can't see beyond that mindset of, am I at an A, B, C, D? And if
Right.
I'm at like a B or A, even if there's room for growth and improvement, then I'm okay.
Right.
That to me is a red flag. It is a sign that maybe the intentions aren't rooted in the best perspective and the place that it should be.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. You know, you've
Yeah.
dropped some pretty amazing nuggets, and we could probably go on for another hour about the topic. How would you, what would be your parting words today for us?
I'm real big on centering belonging and as part of
Mm.
this broad DEI conversation. I think that that's also really important topic. And one of the things that I often share is that it's hard for any person, regardless of their demographics and background, but any person to show up at their best in any environment if they're always questioning whether or not they belong. So if they're
Mm.
questioning, do I belong here? Am I seen and heard? Am I valued? Do I have full opportunity for success? Do my opinions count? Am I safe? If people are questioning those things, then they are not showing up at their best. And when I think about all of the different organizations that are doing mission critical work, right, in so many regards, um, when people that are part of those organizations do not feel that sense of belonging, they're not bringing their A game to that environment, which means they're not showing up at their best. And when we consider that, it should give us all pause in a way to where we question, what is our responsibility within my sphere of influence that I can help create those opportunities for belonging? What does that look like? And how can I now lean into that more? I think that's an important question that every single one of us should be asking around every environment that we find ourselves dwelling in, whether it's the community work we're doing, our homes, our families, the workplace. But how do we, within our sphere of influence, create that sense of belonging? And it doesn't take a certain position or title, it just takes a willingness and to lean into that choice to say, yes, this is important enough for me to care enough about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour, I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. It has been illuminating. I want to encourage you to connect with Dr. Nika White on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for all of the information you shared. It was a great pleasure to have you. This podcast highlights lived experiences, inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We always share profound and courageous dialogues that influence diversity, equity, and inclusion by breaking the barriers and labels of stereotypes, confronting biases, and offering best practices to achieve a more cultural mindset. Nika, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was,
I've enjoyed every minute of it.
oh, me too.